Everybody. I am so excited to introduce our speaker. Her name is Sue Brookhart. She is a professor emerita in the School of Education at Duquesne University and an independent educational consultant and author based in LA, California. Her research interests include the role of both formative and summative classroom assessment in student motivation and achievement, the connection between classroom assessment and large-scale assessment and grading. And really, we asked her to join us because we saw a need in our resources with our success criteria and learning goal. So welcome, Sue Burkhart.
Thank you. Let me see if I can, hi everybody. I'm glad you're here. Let me see if I can get a screen share up. Okay, are you seeing my slides?
Yes, we are.
Yes, indeed. All right, so off I go here. Find my. So I'm going to talk about learning targets and success criteria, but I'm going to spend more time on success criteria because I haven't looked terribly deeply into the tools for teachers, but for the most part, the tools for the lesson plans I've seen have had the learning targets were fine. It was how they were worked out through success criteria that needed some help. So as you already, I hope, know, learning targets are a statement that describes what students will learn in today's lesson in language students can understand from the point of view of a student who is learning it for the first time, which means you can't just take a teacher instructional objective and flip it around and say, I will, instead of the student will, because most of those include descriptions of things that students who are learning it for the first time wouldn't say it like that. It's not that you can't use content relevant vocabulary, but you can't, you need to say it in the way that a student would be thinking about it. Connected to something you make them do, make, say, or write. I use the term performance of understanding for that. That's not my term, that's a David Perkins term, but the idea is you have to make them do something because that's how students learn, and that's also what produces your evidence and what you apply the success criteria to. And then a learning target also provides students things to look for, the success criteria, so that they can assess their understanding as they're working, and you can be looking for those same things as you observe students working or students work. And then that's what you base your feedback on. Ultimately, that's what you base your grade on. But for now, we're not talking about ultimate, we're talking about while students are learning. So a learning target is a lot more than a statement, a lot more than a sentence on the board or a sentence in the top of a learning journal. It's a statement, sure, because we think in words, so you have to give them some language. There's content, of course. There's not no such thing as a content-free lesson. There's something you make them do that is at once the vehicle of their learning and also what produces the evidence that you and they both can use formatively. And then there's this piece that we're focusing on today, that students need to be very clear about what they're looking for. And the whole thing is the learning target. So when Smarter Balance says write a learning target for your tools for teachers, yeah, it is a sentence, but that isn't in an actual functioning on the ground lesson. That's only the sort of intro or summary of the learning target. You have a learning target if students are actually aiming for that, and they can't aim for that unless they're doing something about it, and they can't do something about it unless they know what to look for. So the whole thing is the learning target. And I think that solves a lot of problems for people who think somehow a statement on the board or in the air at the beginning of the lesson is going to be somehow change the way students look at things. It's not going to happen that way. So the learning target, using a learning target supports a student's formative learning cycle. Students should have this little script running in their head. Where am I going? Where am I now? Where to next? Some people say, where am I going? Where am I now? How can I close the gap? The idea is that they're actively pursuing learning. That's the idea of a learning target. And this is the way assessment people would write about this. Where am I going? Where am I now? Where to? In fact, they have, and you know some of the people who have. But if we had a card-carrying educational psychologist in the room, they would be describing the exact same concepts in terms of the self-regulation of learning. They wouldn't put it this way, but if you look at what the formative learning cycle says and what most theories of self-regulation of learning talk about, it's the same process. The idea is that the kid is learning, is aiming for something. It's the aim that's the target metaphor. It's not the big red and white circles. So in order to aim for something, you need what? Well, in real aiming, you use a bow and arrow or whatever else you're aiming. But in lessons, what you need is something to work on that leads to some work and some criteria for you to use and for your teachers to use. And before we go directly to criteria, I also want to point out just by example, the difference between an instructional objective and a learning target, this point of view thing that I was talking about. It's not just switching third person to first person. Anybody could do that. You wouldn't need to be an educator to do that. So here's an example from an exponent lesson, which in most places would be taught in 8th grade. That's why it's an 8th grade comment. I have seen curricula where it was taught in 6th grade, but at any rate. There's the standard, great big broad thing. The instructional objective is just one of many that you would teach under that, and you might, in your curricula, they might not be called instructional objectives. They might be called indicators or something. But every curriculum has them. They're things that you break down the standard into in order to be able to teach. So here is one. The student will be able to apply properties of integer exponents to simplify expressions. And that would be actually a couple lessons it would probably take to do that instructional objective. But for today's lesson, a student might think I'm learning to use the rules for simplifying expressions with exponents in them. Notice it's the same concept, but it's closer to the way a student might explain it. And then the success criteria are more specific, more granular, if you're used to using the metaphor of like a rock and then pebbles and then sand. I can show why you add exponents this, I can show why you multiply exponents that, and then I can simplify those expressions. So a learning target statement isn't just you take the instructional objective and stick an I on the front. You have to think it through in terms of a student. And another characteristic that learning targets need to have is that they need to be the right one in the sense of where they are in a trajectory, that they come from whatever the students learned before, and they lead to whatever students are going to learn next, which it can be a little bit of an issue for the lessons and tools for teachers, because they're not whole units. Most of them are single lessons, but they need to pick students up where they're ready to, at their readiness level, and take them to some spot where they could go on and do the next thing, whatever that is. And that's another thing that makes a learning target the right one. Not only is it in terms of the way a student would say it, but it's the right one in terms of what the student is ready to do next. They also, they meaning Heidi and Amy, asked me to kind of describe, this isn't just smarter, balanced, good idea, or not just Sue Brookhart's good idea. There is a fair amount of research support that says So they asked me to mention research, and I'm only going to do 2 slides because I want to talk more about how to actually do it. But this is not just somebody's good idea. Targets that students actually comprehend and that they know why they're going there actually help students get there. And regarding the success criteria part, there have been studies in all grade levels and in many different topic areas that show that when students actually understand the criteria that for good work, their achievement increases. And some of these studies have also, it's not in the slide because they haven't all, but some of these studies have also looked at student motivation, and when the students get that feeling of, oh, I know what to do, their motivation increases often. So with all of that by way of introduction, I'm going to move into success criteria. Sometimes I talk about those as student look-fors because it's literally what you're looking for in the work. And you can share them in many different ways, and there's no one best way. The best way depends on what the criteria look like and how they fit in the lesson with the kind of work they're doing. But there are some ways that people have shared them. The more important thing for me than what exact format you put them in is, do you make kids use them? Do you set up explicit times during the lesson when students are supposed to check their work or assess their work? Do you, as you're walking around looking at student work or introducing the student work or talking to students about their work, do you use the language of the look-fors when you address them about their work and their learning, so that they hear it and see it all the time? If you just mention a learning target, or even just give kids some success criteria at the beginning of the lesson, but don't do anything during the lesson to keep it top of mind, it won't be top of mind, even for the most dutiful and well-intentioned student. So we're going to look at some examples of those, but I'm going to start with what not to do because, you know, sad stories are so much more dramatic than good examples. The 2 biggest errors I have seen is people using success criteria that amount to just restating the learning target, which often comes when people don't realize that you need another level of breakdown for success criteria. So a student says, the learning target says, for instance, I can write a good descriptive paragraph. And the teacher says, well, I'll know that you can write a good descriptive paragraph when you write a good descriptive paragraph. Well, yeah, but that's it doesn't help students who don't already know how to do that to learn into that, aim for that learning target. So you need to say things like, well, it starts with a topic sentence that describes, that names what you're describing. And then all of the words, especially the vivid verbs and the vivid adjectives, contain something that gives you some imagery, something you can, remind you of something you can taste or touch or feel or smell or whatever the 5th one is. And so on, so that the kids know what they're looking for in their paragraphs to know whether they're in fact descriptive. And another common error that I'm going to illustrate with what I think is a heartbreaking story is success criteria that focus on following directions or the requirements for the assignment. I see a lot of that kind of mistakes in rubrics, and that's the sad example I have. This was from a lesson of, I think it was 5th graders. They were learning to write poetry. They were learning to write small forms of poetry like diamond poems and haiku and acrostic poems. And today's lesson, they were given a large, almost poster-sized paper that could be, you know, hung up on the wall. And they were to compose a poem using one of the forms they'd learned and illustrate it, and so that the teacher could put these up all over the wall. And these are the criteria she gave them: title, grammar, mechanics, graphics originality, graphics relevance, required elements, which sort of is redundant to some of the rest of that, and then content accuracy, whatever the heck that means in terms of poetry. Well, to me, when you write a good poem, you need to use form. Of course, that was one of what they were trying to learn. But then you have to use language in order to communicate something to your reader, to wake up an image or an insight in your reader. There's none of that here. So it's basically directions in a box. So what happens when 4 criteria are used? Well, here is one up. This example comes from was online module. So the teachers were sending me examples, and I said, send me an example of a student who did well, and one who didn't do well, and the feedback that you gave. So here is the one that the teacher said did well. This school is no longer, it's been closed. So this is a very old example. I waited to use it so nobody's actually implicated in the example. But so this is a school spirit poem, obviously. That's a lovely rendition of the mascot, probably copied right off the wall. And if you read the poem, you can see that this student actually does know how to use the form for an acrostic poem. And as a poem, it's successful, but it's, you know, tiny, old, and nice. The school, by the way, was small. It was old, and I'm sure she thought it was nice. But, you know, as poetic expression goes, that's minimal. And yet, because of the criteria, this young lady would have gotten the feedback, and there was written feedback under it that I've cut off in order to be able to blow up the rubric, which, by the way, is horrible. It's, even if the criteria were right, this is way too much. The rubric is longer than the poems. It's awful. But the feedback that these criteria give to that student is, you are a fabulous writer of acrostic poems, when in fact she's adequate. Now here's an acrostic poem. This was the one that the teacher sent to me and said this was an unsuccessful attempt. And I'll give you a minute to read it. And remember, I did say this is an old example, so yes, that is an iPod. Yes, that's the Steelers helmet, not football. That's the helmet, which is a thing in Western Pennsylvania. Kids draw pictures of the helmet. And so some sort of old style video game stuff there. But now this poem actually gives you a little bit of insight into Erin, who may be using some cliches there and may be kind of the class cut up and proud of it, but at least he's using his words, and you get a little insight into the personality, at least that the student wants to present as having. Starts out bad, and then as you notice, it gets better, and it ends up really good. But because of the criteria, the feedback this kid gets is, my poem isn't very good. In fact, in the part that I've cut off, the teacher writes, D, good job. You just did some things that cost you points. Now, as the teacher was writing with her little pen, D, good job, something should have jolted in her mind that there is something wrong somewhere, but apparently not. And even the following directions errors, or so, he spelled aggression with 1 G. Well, that's a pretty big word for a little guy. Whereas nice, she spelled that right, but that's not a very ambitious word. So, and there are some other little things like that in there. But the feedback that these bad criteria give to poor Erin is, I'm not a very good poet. And if this happens over and over again, by the time Aaron gets to high school and has some say about whether he's going to take more English, his answer is probably going to be, heck no, I'm not very good at English, or something like poetry sucks and I'm no good at it, or something like that. He's not going to go home and say, Mom, I did write a really nice poem, but my teacher's criteria were pretty messed up. He's going to think this is what a good poem is. So I hope, and I should say that every time you see criteria that are about following directions, there will be at least one Aaron, even if it's not as dramatic and heartbreaking, depending on what the assignment is. That what's wrong with criteria that include the directions is they mismeasure student achievement. If you need a directions checklist for kids to use on their own so they don't turn it in until they've got all that stuff, that's fine. But the criteria for the learning, which is what we're talking about today, learning targets and the success criteria for the learning, those need to be about learning, not directions. So here's a good one. This comes from I think it's another 5th grade, actually. This was published in a magazine called Teaching Children Mathematics. And Brayfogle noticed that her kids could solve their math problems, but they couldn't explain what they did very well. So she picked 3 criteria. You notice the criteria here are on across the top. To me, it matters not how you put them or whether they're even in a rubric. But the criteria are showing math knowledge, using problem-solving strategies, and writing an explanation, which she got from the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. Her brilliant addition was writing all those performance level descriptions that help students read themselves into the criteria. So something like, I write what I did and a little about why I did it. And I explain most of my work. That a student could see in their work, and then the rubric shows them what to do if you want to do even better than that. But notice there knows nothing about directions, nothing like I did all the problems, I put my name on the paper, I was neat. Those things are clearly important, and the teacher would clearly be monitoring them, but those aren't the learning success criteria. So how do you write these things? Well, for learning targets about concepts, the success criteria colleagues in the work, like the one you just saw, the math example you just saw. For learning targets about procedural knowledge, the success criteria would certainly include the steps. I did this stuff, that stuff, this stuff, that stuff, like I should have. And they may also include qualities that show how the student understands what the steps are doing. If there are learning targets that generalize across a set of tasks, like the math problem solving one I just showed you, a general rubric is better than new success criteria for every lesson because the kids will eventually internalize those criteria. But you don't have to focus on the whole rubric for every lesson. You may pick one criteria to focus on. Today we're talking about good explanations. And then picking up what I started to say before, then during the lesson, have the students use them, and you use the language of the success criteria instead of just picking random stuff to say to the kids, or instead of talking about their work but with other language, use the language that you have specified in the success criteria so they learn how to apply it, so they see that you're looking for it, and they learn how to look for it themselves. So the rest of this slide deck is simply a bunch of examples that are, and I hesitate to, I mean, you guys are instructors who are much more close to the content. So I'm not saying this is the way you would teach it. I'm saying this is the way some teachers who have given me examples. So here's one from elementary reading. I can watch what a character says, looks like, and feels in the beginning and end of a story to see if the character changed. So this is early elementary. They were using a graphic organizer for the evidence. In fact, in this actual class, the teacher used a whole class graphic organizer where the kids gave her the ideas and she wrote the words, because these kids weren't actually writing big words yet. But the criteria are the character traits identify the important ones for the story? Can I tell when a character began to change? Can I explain why that event helped the character to change? Does my explanation make sense? So these are, this is an example of one of those more conceptual sets of success criteria, but these are what you're looking for. You're not just looking for a full graphic organizer, or at least you shouldn't be. Here's another example. This one's math. This one is an example of the more procedural kind of thing. When kids, the kids in this class were just learning that you can graph 2 points, and then you can graph a function by picking 2 points, an ordered pair x, y, and then drawing the line between them, and that will, for sure, include all the other points in the function. So I can identify appropriate x values. I can calculate the y value for any one of those. I can graph coordinate points. So maybe that should say 2 coordinate points, and connect them with a line. I can use mathematical language in my explanation. Well, so those first 3 are procedural. I can use mathematical language in my explanations and explain the relationship between x and y. That's more conceptual. So, and that would be at the beginning when you're just learning to do this. Later on, once picking the 2 points and getting the line is sort of automatic, then you might use a more general math problem solving rubric, because the point isn't that they're learning to graph. The point is they know how to graph, and that's how they're solving some problems that you're giving them that day. Here's an elementary math example where the success criteria are in a little YouTube, almost a little rap thing, to help students know when to use regrouping when they're subtracting. And there's a little subtraction rap that this teacher did not write. It's on YouTube. That says basically, more on the top, no need to stop. More on the floor, go next door. And with examples and some catchy music. But those are the criteria. When do you borrow? When do you regroup? If there's more on the floor, if there's more on the bottom, that's when you do it. Here is one that's done by, it's conceptual, and it's done by guided questions about using text evidence as clues for reading informational text. So they're given a little process. They have to underline the clues. Then they have to write 1 or 2 sentences in the margin about each piece of evidence, and then draw a conclusion or make an inference that draws that all together. That's what they're going to do. That's not what they're going to learn. It's what they're going to do. So that's the performance of understanding. What they're going to learn is how to make inferences. And the success criteria for today's performance is, did I underline clues that actually are clues that help me figure out what the author's trying to say, not just random, the boy or something. Did I write the sentences, and did those sentences connect it to something the author's trying to say? Did I put the clues together? And when I did that, did it make sense? And here's a middle school example. I'm just about ready in for time here. So these middle school kids were learning how to use flashback. So they read a piece of narrative that used flashback. And again, their success criteria are things that they're going to actually look for in their own understanding. Find the shift, explain the transition, explain why that might be a good event to flash back to, and so on. And then as the teacher is watching the students work, or as they're discussing what they've done, you use this language, well, where was the shift in time? How did you know that was a shift in time? Why do you think the author chose that event to flash back to? And so as the students are actually doing their work, they're looking for the right things that will give you and them evidence of learning how and why authors use flashback in stories. So all of this is sort of, I don't want to say organic, well, I guess maybe organic's the word. It's the whole thing, the target, the success criteria, the making them use the success criteria, what you ask them to do. If what you ask them to do doesn't give them a chance to do that kind of work if they are able, then you won't get the evidence, so the success criteria won't apply. So it's a whole big ball of wax, the point of which is for students to be, let me not make you dizzy, but the point of which is for students to be able to do this, to know where they're going, to keep track. This makes it look like it's just three linear things. It's not really. It's one then the other. Where am I now? Where am I now? Where am I next? Oh, there's my transition. How I explain that, on and on. So the point is that students learn, they have what they need to be able to participate in a formative learning cycle or in self-regulation of learning, as a learning theorist would say it. So that is what I have for you today. And again, I'm going to make you dizzy. I'm going to fletch back to my questions slide and going to say, are there any questions? And since I've lost my pictures, I'm going to get out of my slideshow so I can go back to see Amy, who I think is helping me with.
Yes, I'm monitoring the chat box, and so far no questions in the chat box just yet, but we do have a hand raised. So Beth Johnston, you have a hand raised. Would you like to ask your question?
I know previously we've done some guidelines like on how many success criteria we should have, just in general. Is there a good number? Like, I know it's hard if
this
it's a big...
This is Sue Brookhart's opinion. It may not be smarter balanced. There's a difference between what should be and what you have to do to turn in something that's useful for, in this case, smarter balanced tools for teachers. I am less concerned about the number than if they are substantive and about learning. I think Smarter Balanced has said something like 3, which is nice. Actually, that's a good number. But if it's 4, that doesn't bother me. It might be that, you want to keep a lesson in tools for teachers to 3 so that somebody doesn't have to manage a huge list. And in fact, I would say if there's a huge list, you've got a couple lessons waiting to be taught there. You can't teach kids everything in one lesson. And if you have many fewer than 2 or 3, you've just got the learning target all over again, and you're either not being specific enough or maybe your lesson is too tiny. So 3 is a nice number, but I have seen lessons with that used a rubric, say, that had 5 rows of criteria that worked just fine. Although some of those, a part of it depends on where in the learning trajectory this is. So those kids, for instance, that use that math problem solving rubric, get the right answer, problem solving, and I can explain my answer. They had a couple of lessons where all they focused on was I can explain my answer. And eventually, though, they had to do it all. So whether the lesson was at the beginning of that sequence of lessons or at the end, they would have had more or fewer success criteria as they were ready for them. But several, more than one. If it's only 1 or 2, you look at them and make sure that you're not. I have met some teachers who haven't really, good teachers. I'm not trying to say that there was anything wrong with the way they were used to thinking about it, but they weren't used to actually articulating in detail what students should be looking for, because it simply never occurred to them. And once they realized that if you do, because they knew what they were looking for, but they were sort of internal mental criteria, that once you do that and you share, I mean, this is part of the formative thing, right? If you share what they are looking for, the kids will help you learn, help them learn, because now they can help you too. So all of that, a lot of fancy dancing to not be pinned down to a number. For me, it's the function, but if it's too many, remember, we're talking about a lesson. And if it's too few, you're probably just reproducing the learning target. And it also is very much to do with the level of, when kids are brand new, you ask them to look for minuscule little things. And as kids get more expertise at whatever the topic area is, you can say something like, okay, here's an example, not a really great one, but it's popped into my mind and it does illustrate the point. When kids are first learning how to put colons in the middle of compound sentences and whatever, they look for colons, they look for the connecting conjunction and all of that. Eventually, their 8th grade essay teacher is going to have one criteria that says mechanics. And they're supposed to look for all those things because they know to do it. So, the number of criteria changes according to the lesson and the kids too.
Yeah, that's really great. It does change. We do try to provide the guidance about 3 because we don't want it to be 10. And so if you have 4, we're not going to wrestle you down and make you choose 3.
Just to be clear, the directions for putting something in a very specific repository that has a format that everybody's got to follow is different from me saying, when you teach, should never have more than 3 success criteria, because I would never say that, if that makes sense.
We also discussed previously, Beth, that if there are additional success criteria that would be part of the progression, maybe the lesson before or maybe the lesson after, that another place to put some of that information could be in the things to consider, because our lessons are very focused and single lessons versus units. And what we're trying to avoid is having 10 success criteria that would go across a unit and really zero in on that lesson and that activity.
Right, because that's to do with the purpose of your tool.
Yes.
And I think that's a good purpose. In fact, I think if you had whole units in there, some teachers would use them, but a lot of them wouldn't. Or some teachers might dive into a whole unit, just pick the lesson they wanted anyway. So I think the way you've set it up is just fine. And for that purpose, say 3, 4 success criteria. Depends on, it is good.
Yeah,
I'm
perfect.
interested in the quality of the success criteria. Are they things that you can actually use during the lesson to get kids to look for? That's what would make me happy. And that's what that'll teach.
We had another hand raised, Sue. Shelley, was your question answered, or do you have an additional question?
I have an additional question. I just wanted to clarify. I noticed that some of the success criteria was phrased as questions, some were statements. Is there a preference? Is it just sort of up to the lesson?
I often use guiding questions in slides because they're small enough to put on a slide. If you have a rubric, I mean, this is, you're smiling, you know exactly what, rubrics are lovely. I love rubrics. In fact, I think they're great, but they don't make very good slides. So my slides are about making the point that the success criteria need to be the right thing to look for more than the format. Statements and success guiding questions that's a wordsmithing thing. For instance, if can I explain, or can I find when what was that one with the flashback? Can I find when the time shifted? It could also be, I can find the time shift. That's wordsmithing to me. The important thing is, yeah, they have to, if they're going to do a flashback, they do have to be able to find when it is that all of a sudden we're not talking about the same time period. So sometimes it's a demonstration. For little kids, that's often a demonstration. You make a good capital A when yours looks like the one on the wall behind me. And it's just a model. You wouldn't say, oh, and there's an upward diagonal and a downward diagonal. That's ridiculous. And sometimes there's modeling or demonstrations, even in something, an 8th grade math teacher demonstrating how to solve a certain kind of problem. Might do a think aloud on the board and say, this is a good way for you to do it. So, so yes, you're right. It's about the lesson, but that list of various things, a think aloud, a demonstration. I got them all here. Rubrics, checklists, sometimes guiding questions, analyzing exemplars. Students can pull the criteria out of good work themselves sometimes. And each of those, as you can imagine, fitting into the lesson is a big part of it too.
And so, Shelley, we don't have a preference if you write a statement, a question. Like Sue said, we want to make sure that we have solid success criteria. So I love that example that she gave about, I can write a good descriptive paragraph, and that doesn't really tell me what the success criteria is. And whether it's written as a statement, like an I can write a topic sentence, I can add descriptive details, or if it's a question, either way is acceptable. We just really, it's more about the content and that we're clearly identifying the success criteria. We have another question in the chat box, Ann Warren.
Hi, Susan. First of all,
Hi.
thank you, whomever's in charge of this for bringing you on. Our district has been following the policy paper for a year now as our Bible. As far as Smarter Balance, our district, we're working on progressions because we do piecemeal, and we're trying to get our instructors to understand that this lesson, learning target, is a piece of the bigger success criteria. So, you know, we bring in the learning target, but it's difficult because it's a lot of work. I think we use Popham's or maybe Ainsworth's model, but I would like to see these lessons as part of the bigger picture. So I guess teachers would want to take one lesson because you have something in mind and you're going to go look for it. But wouldn't it be nice as part of the bigger picture? I'm wondering what you think about.
Absolutely. I use the term learning target for a lesson-sized chunk. Some people use the term learning target for a learning goal of any size. And in plain English, that is true. There should be some sort of, the kids should know, not only I am trying to learn how to graph linear functions like this with one line today, but that the whole point of this whole section in my whether it's a unit or a sequence of lessons or whatever, is that eventually there are a lot of things that are related in a kind of linear way, like, and they should be able to tell you something, height and weight, whatever. That solving problems, it's helpful to be able to draw a line through things.
Right.
And that knowing that you're going somewhere bigger is important for kids as well. I have worked and met people that call that the long-term learning target, and then they call the little ones the daily learning targets. That's fine, except I think when you use the same term for two things, it's easy to, oh, I have a learning target, and they're just learning to, you know, and so you get things like a high school English teacher saying, oh, well, we're just doing Hamlet this 6 weeks. And a kid would, no, you're not doing Hamlet for 6 weeks. What is it you want me to learn by reading Hamlet? And because I and my colleague Connie Moss and all the other people I work with have had more trouble getting, trouble's the wrong word, it's harder to get people to realize that we need that lesson by lesson. Why is my seat in the chair right now kind of thing for kids? Nobody's going to argue you need a long-term learning target. So we've chosen to put our focus on there needs to be this today, this existential, what am I doing here in this lesson? And what ought I be able to, what should I know by the end of the lesson that I didn't know going in? Every kid has a right to know that. And so we use the word learning target for that. But a learning target in a little one-off, it's not beads on a necklace. It's more like that arrow or something. You're going somewhere. And the kids should kind of know where they're going in general, at least, But what'll give them more traction for actually learning and taking that next baby step in their little journey toward that big goal is today's learning target. So that's a big, long way of saying, yes, you absolutely need both. And the learning target, the daily ones, do need to be in the right order and in the right. And I've had people ask me, well, if the kids haven't met that target today, do I just go on tomorrow? And no, but you might do something else, because kids should never think, I'm looking at my watch, sorry about that, because I promised to be stopped soon. Kids should never think, oh, we're just doing today what we did yesterday. So maybe tomorrow, they're not really great yet at graphing linear functions. So tomorrow, the learning target still says I can graph linear functions. But what you ask them to do is a different set of problems, slightly harder. And the success criteria may grow a little bit, or they may, as long as one of the things in that, either the statement, the performance, the chunk of content, or the success criteria changes. So yeah, we're still learning to graph linear functions, but today's problems are a little harder than yesterday's, or today's problems, we're going to add a success criteria to make sure that you also do this when you graph linear functions or whatever. So there needs to be some momentum to it. When I was absent in high school, I'd always call my girlfriend and say, what I miss. And you know, more times than not, she said, you're all going to be able to say it. Nothing. We did the same thing as we did yesterday. A kid should never feel like that in a lesson. There's always, maybe, yeah, I graphed linear functions again, but by golly, I graphed more of them and I did it faster and these were harder, or something. They ought to know. Amy, I'm babbling here, and it's the time I told you I would stop. Should I take another question, or what would you like to do?
Well, thank you, Sue, for being mindful of the time, and I don't see any more in the chat box. I do want us to break out into our randomized breakout rooms. So what we have set up for you guys is the opportunity to debrief with each other.